What's up, everybody? We're back at it with another English 375 class. We got a sweet topic today that we're going to talk about. Our last video, we talked some about movement and we talked about negation and we talked about the difference between auxiliary verbs and modal verbs and teasing those two things apart with negation. So modal verbs being things like will and should and might and could, and auxiliary verbs being like be and have. Today, we've got a fun lecture. I'm excited. This is a topic that I quite like. We're going to be talking more about auxiliary verbs and the role they play in tree structures. So I told you before when we were looking at things in T, I was kind of always punting by only using examples that used modal verbs that are generated directly into T. And I was doing this for a specific reason, and that reason was that they're simpler. But today, we've passed simplicity. I don't even know what week it is anymore. Time is meaningless. But we've come to the point where we're going to make it a little bit more complex. Hopefully pleasantly so. Enjoyably so, if I have anything to say about it. So today, we have several topics. One main topic in a few parts. Just two parts. So we're going to be talking about auxiliaries. And we're going to be talking about auxiliaries and their two aspects, their two parts. Then, once we talk about this sort of two-part structure of auxiliaries, it's listed in one, we're going to be looking at what's called affix hopping, which is the movement pattern that auxiliaries take. That's really the reason we haven't been talking about auxiliaries up to this point, is they have a fairly complex movement pattern that's observable in the English language. And so we're going to be discussing that now that we've covered some of the basics of movement a little bit further. A quick recap of the last lecture, things that we covered. Well, we talked again, like I said, about the difference between modal verbs, which are generated directly into T, and auxiliary verbs, which often appear in T, but they don't get generated there. So as a review, we said that while modal verbs get generated directly in T, auxiliary verbs actually get generated lower down in V as a normal verb, and they get raised up into the T position if it's empty. So they have a variable position. If T is empty, they'll move up into the T position, like you can see in I have not eaten, where have is higher up than not. But sometimes they stay lower down in the tree if there's something in T, like a modal verb, right? And we see that in scenarios like I should not have eaten, right? Not eaten, or not have eaten, where have is below the not, right? So it's in a variable position. You can actually see it in its base generated place in V, or sometimes you can see it up in T. So we've covered the movement of the auxiliary verb itself in the last class. Today, what we're going to be looking at is the other elements of an auxiliary verb. We looked at this briefly, and I told you, I promised you I would talk about it later, is that the auxiliary verb seems to affect the verb that comes after it. Have eaten, right? Why does that eat go to eaten? And we see this in several different patterns. We're going to look at 3 of them today. Boom. So we have these auxiliary verbs. We're going to look at has. Have is the infinitive version there, to have. And be, is and was being variants of that auxiliary verb be, right? To be. And we see 3 forms. And we note that each of these 3 forms has a different effect, excuse my terrible pointing, a different effect on the verb that follows it. So we have has eaten, and we have, that's what we'll call the perfective form, has eaten. There's also this form is eating. Is seeming to add this ing form onto the end. We'll call that the progressive, right? Is eating. He is eating. And we have this last one, was eaten. Was eaten. And that's the passive, right? I was eaten by a dog. We always like morbid examples here in linguistics classes. I was eaten by a dog. few things to note about these forms. They come in one of two auxiliary forms, like we talked about, either the have version, like this perfective, has eaten, or some form of a to be, like is or was. But this alone isn't enough to give us the whole story. What we need in order to capture the meaning of a progressive, what we need in order to capture the meaning of an auxiliary is not just its base form. It's not just this auxiliary itself, the has or the is. You need it in concert with the ending. So what's telling us that this is a perfective is the combination of have, in this case has, have, and un. Have x, have verbin, have written, have eaten, have whatever. And similarly, what's telling us the progressive meaning of this auxiliary is the to be form, here is, and the ing, is eating, is sleeping, is studying, is xing, right? It's the combination of this auxiliary and the ending that gives us that meaning. And here again, what differentiates these two, the progressive and the passive, is the endings, because they both are forms of to be, is and was, right? What differentiates them is eating, the ing gives you progressive in combination with to be, and en here, was eaten, gives you the passive. So what we see is that auxiliary verbs have two parts to their meaning. They have the actual auxiliary itself there, the have and the be, and then they have an ending that gets added on to the following verb. Those are the two parts, and neither of those two parts gives you the complete meaning without the other. They're two parts of the same thing. This gives us our clue as to how we're going to generate them. We're actually going to generate these things as a single unit. And it's going to look like this. Right? We're going to generate, oh, I smudged everything. We're going to generate the perfective auxiliary verb, v perfective, as, oh man, I got to rewrite some stuff because I smudged it too much. I'll get better at this. Probably won't. Let's see if I can not smudge it this time. Yeah, it's just written terribly now. Much better than being smudged. Here, v perfect, v perfective here, splits into its two component parts. The auxiliary itself, have, and this affix, un, right? This is like has eaten. Here, what this is telling us is that the v progressive, remember our subcategories from before where we talked about things like transitive and intransitive, and for nouns we talked about things like plural and singular and anaphors and pronouns and mass and count, all these different subcategories. Here's more subcategories. This is a v perfective, have and en. A v progressive, which takes a form of to be and ing, like is eating. And here we have v passive, which takes be and en, like was eaten. So that each of these forms, perfective, progressive, and passive, is made up of two pieces that get generated as a unit. Sweet, we're already on track. We're already making good progress in explaining how these things work. There's one trick remaining. These things are getting generated under a single V head in a way that we've never seen before. This is a V head that's getting split into two pieces. You're allowed to think that's weird. You're allowed to say, hey, stop, Ross, can we do that? Of course, I'm the teacher. We can do whatever we want. I get to make things up if I like. But yeah, we can do this. This is fine. But there's another question you should be asking yourself, or another thing you should be noticing. If we generate these things together like this, we don't get the right linear order. Right? Because the linear order isn't I have an eat. It's I have eaten. I have an eat. Blast. We actually don't, we want these things to be generated together because of their shared meaning in accomplishing these forms. But we actually don't want them to appear next to each other. Note that the en in the perfective here doesn't actually appear on have or has. It appears on the next verb. It hops. It lowers itself down onto the next verb. We're going to have to do a form of movement in order to get this to work. I'll show you that with my tree on the other side of this slide, this manual slide. Oh, I gotta change arms as well. Okay, so what I've done on this side of my whiteboard, handy dandy whiteboard, is given you the underlying representation, the base generation of the sentence, he has eaten. I'm trying to get my glare under control here. He has eaten. He has eat. Right? And so this is the problem. Note again, here's our little perfective V that splits into two pieces here, very strangely. Very strangely. This is the problem I was just talking about. This isn't the right order for he has eaten. Even if I smudge it, it's still not the right order. Still not good. He has eaten is what we want, and instead we have he has an eat. So we have to do two things here. Two things. One of them is more obvious, one of them is less obvious. The first thing we have to do is get this down into onto eat. This goes through the affix lowering just like we would expect. Right? Remember when we would lower past tense from T onto a V? We're essentially going to do the same operation to lower this affix onto eat. So I'll show you what that looks like. We'll draw that into our tree, handy dandy tree. I'll unsmudge things as I go. Eaten. So this is going to drop down like this. Ah, blast. He has eaten. He has eaten. He has eaten. Boom, we got our word order correct. Nailed it. But there's still one thing. One thing we have to do. Remember last class. It's a test. The other thing we have to do is raise this V up to T. It's a thing that auxiliary verbs do. Remember we showed this last time. Has rises up to T. Does it matter for the word order? In this sentence, no, it doesn't. Right? We have he has eaten already. But nonetheless, for consistency's sake, we have to do this. And the reason we have to do this is what we talked about in the last lecture. If we had the sentence, he has not eaten, then we would see that has is for sure up in T, because he has, the not would be here, he has not eaten, the has would have had to raise up to T to get higher than that negation. So we know it doesn't stay down here in V. If that doesn't make sense, either send me an email asking me a question about it, or go quick review the last lecture that's posted about auxiliaries and negation to see that interaction. Otherwise, if you're too lazy to do that, take my word for it, and believe me when I say there's good evidence that this V doesn't stay here, despite the fact that it doesn't in this example change the word order. It doesn't stay here, yet it moves up to T. Now, we have the right word order. He has eaten, right? What's really cool about this is that we have these two pieces of this V perfective, has and n, and neither of them gets pronounced in V. Both of them get generated in this V, which itself is weird, yet neither of them are being pronounced there. Has is raising up to T through our normal V to T movement that we saw last class, and n is moving down to V through this normal affix lowering that we had seen previously from T to V. Here we see it from a V to V, head-to-head movement, as it were. Super cool, really interesting. It's got this split aspect where we take half of it and we rip it up, and we take the other half and we shove it down below. And we've got good evidence for each of these movements. We have good evidence for this en because, well, we can see it actually being pronounced here. We have good evidence for this has raising up. If we try, he has not eaten. Adding that negation in shows us that. Sweet, awesome. That's how these auxiliaries work. That's the majority of what I wanted to impart to you today. But we can get more interesting than that. We can get cooler than that. I'll show you through an example of stacked auxiliaries, where I think this really shows its cool explanatory power in syntax, is when we get tougher sentences. So when we get a sentence like this. I'm going to erase some things here to make a little room. If I had different colored markers, they would come in handy. But I've only got green, so green it is. When self-isolating social distancing is lifted, I will procure some different colored markers. All right, so now we looked at the sentence, he has eaten. Now let's look instead at the sentence, he has been eaten. He has been eaten. Not he has eaten, but he has been eaten, right? Changes who's eating who here. He has been eaten. So the sentence in linear order looks something, not like that, but rather like this. He has been eaten. But the structure, we can break these things down into pieces in a really cool way. Right? We want to tease these things, the affixes, apart from the bases. And it reveals to us something peculiar. He has it reveals to us this structure. He has been eaten, right? And think, look, when we combine this, we get he has been eaten, just like we did. I just broke this down, broke the affixes off. Now, chances are what's weird about this is that you've never thought about been, been, B-E-E-N here, however you sociolinguistically pronounce this thing in your dialect. You've never thought of this as having an affix before. Chances are, maybe you have. But chances are you've thought of this as monomorphemic, but it's not. It's not. And here we see two of these auxiliary formations together. You see the perfective, has was our perfective form. That's one of them. And you also see the passive, be, right? There's two auxiliary formations going on here. I'll list them again. I just erased these, but I think it will make it more clear. So we have the V perfect, which splits in, well, I'll say this again when you can actually see it. Just as a recall of the formations and what those looked like, wrong side again, we have here the V perfect, which is have, has, and we have the V passive, which was be, here's be, So you see this cool interleaving process where the V stays or moves up to T regardless, and the affixes hop down in order. So what's actually connected in this sentence, he has been eaten, is like this. There we go. There we go. So we have has is connected to this en, right? V perfect. Have and has. And this be is actually connected to this en, be to give us the passive. And they drop down, right? We see the interleaving pattern. I can show you what this looks, if this isn't clear, which is totally fine at this point, the first time you're hearing it. Never despair. I'll show it to you on the tree. We can expand the current tree that we have to accommodate this structure without any other changes. All right. It's going to take me a second to revamp my tree. If you'd like, you're more than welcome. You're always welcome to try and follow along and draw this tree yourself. Otherwise, I'll happily be doing it and showing you on my board in just a second. All right, let's take a look at what this looks like. Yes, this is in fact the correct side. So now we have the sentence. Well, if we erase this movement, we'll have the underlying form, pre-movement form. Show you the pre-movement underlying representation. He, and then we have this perfective, just like we had before, has n, because we need that meaning in there. Now we have this VP, which is the passive, with this V passive head, which again splits to BN, just like we had over here. BN to a third VP, which is eat. Which is eat. And now what we're going to find is the lowering of the affixes. So this EN is going to plop down onto this B, and this EN is going to plop down onto this eat. I'll show you that in a stepwise fashion. Let's start at the bottom of the tree with the V passive. So at the bottom of this tree, we have this passive, beaten. I gave myself a little more room, very sloppily here, but beaten, with the n dropping on to eat. Eaten, eaten. He has been eaten, we wanted that. Next, we're going to take this en and lower it down as well. Lower it down onto this verb head, the be. Let's do that. Yeah. So now we have has, this is moved down to here, been, this is moved down to here, eaten. Has been eaten. Has been eaten, which is exactly what we wanted it to have with this crazy movement pattern. The last thing, of course, that I undid here that we have to redo now is moving this has up to T. Again, for reasons that were explained in more depth in the last lecture. So we have three different movement patterns here. Not three patterns, three instances. Has raised up, he has, is dropped down. He has been eaten. He has been eaten. Whoa, weird. Crazy. I'm going to erase the things that have moved and replace them with traces in order to make this tree a little bit more readable so we can see what the heck's actually going on here pronouncing-wise. So I replaced the things that are not there anymore, that have moved out of the position that they were generated in, with a little t for trace. So now this, right, this is the trace that has moved up here. Here's a trace that's moved down here, the en. Here's a trace that's moved down here, en. And so now finally we see our sentence come together. He has nothing actually here, right? Both pieces of these are just traces, empty traces. Been eaten. He has been eaten. He has been eaten. How cool is that, right? With this drop down, drop down, drop down, with stacking auxiliaries. This is called affix hopping. It's really neat, I think, that it works like this, that it works with these affixes, with this to be, all of it. Could we stack all three of our auxiliaries? Yeah, technically we could, right? Let me see what a good example of that would be. The example they give in your book tries to show this. This is the question just quickly here at the end. We're about to wrap up, but the question, could you have the perfective, the progressive, and the passive all together stacked in a line? And the answer is like kind of. They're kind of marginal sentences, but you can get them, right? So an example of this, again, it's violent, but you'll forgive me, is like he has been being beaten. He has been being beaten. He has been being beaten. And we could just add another layer there. If you want, like, a nice little challenge, don't cheat and look in your book on page whatever it is. You can try and draw that sentence out. He has been being beaten. That's with the perfective first, the progressive next, and then the passive last. But regardless, this shows us how to take care of these auxiliaries and how we stack these VP structures, interleaving and dropping the affixes down onto the lower pieces. Two things we've covered with auxiliaries over the past two classes, both of them having to do with movement. One is the movement of the auxiliary from V up to T when it's empty. The other one is in these constructions moving the ending down, lowering the ending onto the following verb, and that we can do this iteratively in this affix hopping thing. Whew. All right. Like I said, I promised you a short one. We're a little shorter here today, but this is cool. I'm also excited about this. This is a topic I really like. I think we start with kind of these things that have been following, that we've been building up all semester with that affix lowering from T to V, and now things like, well, I can show you that V goes to T, and then suddenly it all kind of comes together to give us these interesting and sort of satisfying solutions to weird problems for very strange English sentences like he has been being beaten, with these stacks of things. Each of those actually, that whole structure kind of follows from the groundwork that we've already laid. Right? We don't need to do anything crazy in order to get he has been being beaten. It's just a simple series of movements like ones that we've been seeing all semester. Cool. I'm going to cut it here for Wednesday's class. I may have misspoken on my last video, in my last lecture, and said that we have class on this Friday, that would be the 10th. Let me check my calendar. But we in fact do not have class on Friday, April the 10th. That's Good Friday, Friday before Easter. We have no class then. We were originally also scheduled not to have class on Monday, April 13th, but that has since been changed. So we will be meeting on April 13th. Alas and alack, this means that our Friday in-person class that was supposed to be Friday, April 10th, has been canceled. So there'll be no in-person meeting this week. That's unfortunate, and I wish it were otherwise, but I will still have my office hours on Thursday, April 9th from 10 to noon. So if you're missing face-to-face interaction with me, stop by there, ask any questions you have about this kind of crazy affix hopping movement stuff that you have. Otherwise, send me an email. Otherwise, wait. Otherwise, light a signal fire like I suggested before. I'll get to them eventually. Sweet. Thanks for hanging in there, and thanks for watching another video. I hope you learned something. Feel free to rewind, watch the previous video, do whatever you need to do. I'll catch you next time on Monday, April 13th. Monday, April 13th. Or hopefully, even better, I'll catch you at office hours on Thursday, April 9th. Talk to you later.